The last words Sarah spoke to her husband were about tomatoes. "We should plant tomatoes this year," she had said that morning, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, steam curling between them like a ghost. Mia loved tomatoes. Michael had nodded, looking out the kitchen window at their garden, wild now, overgrown, a tangle of weeds and forgotten dreams. He'd opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah had already turned away, and the words died in his throat like everything else had died that day 6 months ago. The garden had once been Mia's kingdom. Their daughter, 7 years old with dirt perpetually under her fingernails and flowers woven into her dark hair, had ruled over every inch of soil with the fierce dedication of someone who understood that growing things required love. She had planted sunflowers that grew taller than she was, strawberries that never quite ripened before she ate them, and morning glories that climbed the fence like they were trying to reach the sky. "Look, Mama," she would call out every evening, her voice bright as birdsong. "Look what grew today." Sarah would come running, and Michael would follow, and they would kneel in the dirt together, the three of them, examining whatever miracle had emerged from the earth. A tomato the size of Mia's fist. A butterfly chrysalis hanging from a branch. A ladybug making its careful way across a leaf. "It's magic," Mia would whisper, her eyes wide with wonder. And Sarah would kiss her forehead and say, "You're the magic, sweetheart." That was before. Before the screech of tires. Before the hospital's fluorescent lights. Before the silence that grew like a wall between them, brick by brick, until Sarah and Michael lived on opposite sides of their own home, two strangers who once knew how to speak the same language. The evening after Sarah mentioned the tomatoes, Michael went to the garden alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of grief, purple and gold and blood red. He stood at the edge of what had once been Mia's sunflower patch, now just dried stalks and empty seed heads, and felt the weight of words he couldn't say pressing against his chest. "I miss her. I miss you. I don't know how to do this. I'm drowning." But Sarah was inside, and he was outside, and there was an ocean between them now, too wide to cross with words that felt too small for the enormity of their loss. He found a wooden stake in the shed, one of Mia's markers that she'd used to label her plants in her careful, crooked handwriting. He found a piece of paper, a pen, and he wrote, "I'm sorry I couldn't save her." He planted the stake in the ground where the sunflowers used to grow, the note wrapped around it, and went inside without speaking. The next morning, when Michael came down for coffee, he found Sarah standing at the kitchen window, staring at the garden. Her shoulders were shaking. He almost went to her, almost closed the distance, but fear held him, frozen fear that if he touched her, she would shatter, or he would, or they both would, and there would be nothing left but broken pieces. When he went outside an hour later, he found a new stake beside his, driven into the earth with force. Sarah's handwriting was jagged, desperate. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect her." Michael's hands trembled as he read it. He sank to his knees in the dirt, in the place where Mia had once planted her sunflowers, and wept for the first time since the funeral. When he could breathe again, he went to the shed and found seeds, tomato seeds, in a packet that Mia had chosen last spring, covered in her fingerprints. He planted them carefully, tenderly, in a small plot he cleared near the stakes. And beside them, he placed another note. "It wasn't your fault." That evening, Sarah came to the garden. She stood for a long time, reading his words, her hand pressed against her mouth. When she left, she took the packet of seeds with her. The next day, she planted peppers beside his tomatoes. Her note read, "It wasn't yours either." But the words felt like lies, because whose fault was it if not theirs? They were her parents. They were supposed to keep her safe. They were supposed to be enough. Michael wrote, "I dream about her every night. In my dreams, I catch her in time." Sarah wrote, "In mine, I never let her go outside. I keep her with me. She's alive and laughing, and I wake up and remember, and it kills me all over again." Michael wrote, "I hear her voice in every room. I see her in every corner. The house is full of ghosts." Sarah wrote, "I see her in you. In your eyes. In your smile. I can't look at you without seeing her." And Michael understood then why they couldn't speak, Why words in the air felt impossible. Looking at each other was like looking at their daughter, like staring at everything they'd lost, and it was too much, too raw, too devastating. So they wrote instead. They planted. As spring deepened into summer, the garden began to fill. Where there had been only weeds, there were now rows of vegetables, carefully tended. Tomatoes and peppers. Lettuce and carrots. Cucumbers climbing stakes that bore their confessions like prayer flags. I'm angry, Michael wrote. At the driver. At God. At myself. At you, sometimes, and I hate that I am. I'm angry too, Sarah responded. At everything. At the world for continuing when she stopped. At parents with living children. At my own heartbeat for going on without her. I don't know how to be her husband anymore, Michael admitted. I don't know how to be anything but her father, and now I'm not even that. I don't know how to be anyone anymore, Sarah wrote back. I'm just this hollow thing, going through motions, waiting. Waiting for what? For it to stop hurting. For her to come back. For someone to tell me this is all a nightmare. The tomatoes grew heavy on their vines. The peppers turned from green to red. And the garden filled with stakes, with notes, with words they couldn't speak but could write, could plant, could let grow in the earth that had once been their daughter's kingdom. Do you remember, Michael wrote, the day she planted the morning glories? She said they were blue like my eyes. She planted pink ones for me, Sarah wrote back. She said they matched my favorite dress. She had such a big heart. The biggest, Michael agreed. She loved so easily. So completely. Like you loved her, Sarah wrote. Like we both did, Michael responded. As summer turned toward fall, the garden became a testament to their grief. Row after row of growing things, each plant marked with their pain, their memories, their love, their fury at the universe for taking their child. I found her baby shoes today, Sarah wrote. They're so small. Were her feet ever that small? I found her drawing of us, Michael wrote. The one where we're all holding hands. She drew herself in the middle. She was always in the middle. Our center. Our everything. What are we without her? Sarah took 3 days to respond to that question. Michael checked the garden every morning, finding nothing new, wondering if he'd gone too far, if she'd retreated back into the silence that had nearly consumed them both. But on the 3rd day, there was a new stake. A new note. We're still her parents. That doesn't end. Death doesn't end that. We're her parents, and we're broken, and I don't know if we can be fixed, but maybe we don't have to be. Maybe broken is what we are now. Maybe broken is okay. Michael read it 7 times. Then he wrote, Can broken people still love each other? I don't know, Sarah wrote. Can they? I never stopped loving you, Michael wrote, his hand shaking so hard the letters came out crooked. Even when I couldn't look at you. Even when I couldn't speak. I never stopped. I never stopped either, Sarah responded. I just didn't know how to love you and grieve her at the same time. I didn't know there was room for both. Maybe we can make room, Michael wrote. Maybe, Sarah wrote back. The first frost came early that year, in late September. Michael woke to find ice crystals on the windows, and his first thought was of the garden, of all those growing things, all those notes, all those words they'd planted in the earth. He rushed outside in his bathrobe, his breath clouding in the cold air. The tomatoes hung dark and frozen on their vines. The peppers had blackened overnight. The lettuce wilted, the cucumber leaves brown and curling. And the stakes, there were dozens now, maybe hundreds, marking every confession, every memory, every piece of their shattered hearts they'd planted in the soil. He heard footsteps behind him. Sarah, also in her bathrobe, her hair uncombed, her face pale in the early morning light. They stood side by side for the first time in months, looking at the destruction. Everything they'd planted, everything they'd grown, killed in a single night. The garden was dying, and winter was coming, and soon there would be nothing but frozen ground and bare earth. It's gone, Sarah whispered, and Michael realized it was the first time he'd heard her voice directed at him since that morning she'd mentioned tomatoes. It's all gone. Michael looked at the frozen plants, at the stakes bearing their grief, at the garden that had held them together even as everything else fell apart. And then he looked at Sarah, really looked at her, for the first time in so long. Saw the hollows under her eyes, The lines that hadn't been there before, the way she held herself like she might break. Not all of it, he said, his voice rusty from disuse. We're still here. Sarah turned to him, tears freezing on her cheeks. Are we? Sometimes I'm not sure. I'm here, Michael said. I'm right here. I can't do this anymore, Sarah said, and Michael's heart stopped. I can't live like this. In silence. Alone. With you, but not with you. I'm so tired, Michael. I'm so tired of being alone. Then don't be, Michael said, and he reached for her hand. Sarah stared at their joined hands like she'd forgotten what touch felt like. Her fingers were ice cold. She'd forgotten her gloves. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to be with you and miss her and not fall apart. Maybe we fall apart together, Michael said. Maybe that's how. Sarah's face crumpled. I miss her so much. Every second of every day. It never stops. I know, Michael said. I know. I miss us too, Sarah said. I miss who we were. I miss talking to you. I miss hearing your voice. I miss everything. I'm right here, Michael said again, and this time he pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, held her as she shook with sobs that came from somewhere so deep they seemed to tear her apart from the inside. She's gone, Sarah gasped against his chest. Our baby is gone and she's never coming back, and I don't know how to survive this. We survive it together, Michael said, his own tears falling into her hair. We survive it the way we did everything else. Together. They sank to the ground, there in the frozen garden, holding each other in the ruins of all they'd planted. The sun rose higher, pale and cold, and around them the garden died, but they held on. Talk to me, Sarah whispered. Please. Just talk to me. So Michael talked. He told her about the dreams he had, where Mia was still alive. He told her about the mornings he woke up and forgot, just for a second, that she was gone, and how that second was both beautiful and devastating. He told her about the guilt that ate at him, the what-ifs that haunted his every moment, the anger that lived in his chest like a second heart. And Sarah listened. And then she talked too. About the way she heard Mia's laughter in other children's voices. About how she'd been driving past the accident site every day, punishing herself, unable to stop. About how she'd wanted to disappear, to stop existing, because existing without their daughter felt impossible. They talked until their voices were hoarse, until the sun was high overhead, until they were both shivering from cold and exhaustion and grief. I'm sorry, Michael said finally. I'm sorry I shut you out. I'm sorry I didn't know how to. I know, Sarah said. I shut you out too. We both did. Can we? Michael's voice broke. Can we try? To not be alone anymore? Sarah pulled back, looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. I'm scared. What if we can't? What if we're too broken? Then we're broken together, Michael said. But we try. We keep trying. For her. For us. Sarah nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. Okay. They went inside together, hands still clasped. Sarah made coffee while Michael started a fire in the fireplace they hadn't used since before. They sat on the couch, not touching, but closer than they'd been in months, and sipped their coffee in a silence that felt different now. Less like a wall. More like a bridge. What do we do now? Sarah asked. Michael thought about the garden, about all those steaks, all those notes. About tomatoes and peppers and morning glories. About their daughter, who had loved growing things, who had understood that you put seeds in the ground and waited and hoped, and sometimes, if you were lucky, something beautiful emerged. We wait for spring, he said. We get through winter. And then we plant again. What if nothing grows? Then we plant again the spring after that. And the one after that. We keep planting until something does. Sarah set down her coffee cup and, hesitantly, leaned her head against his shoulder. Michael held his breath, afraid to move, afraid she'd pull away. But she didn't. She stayed. Tell me a story about her, Sarah whispered. A good one. One I might not remember. So Michael did. He told her about the time Mia had found a caterpillar and insisted on keeping it in a jar by her bed until it made a chrysalis. How she checked on it every day, whispering encouragement, reading its stories. How when it finally emerged as a butterfly, she'd cried because she had to let it go. She understood, Michael said, even at 7. She understood that loving something sometimes means letting it go. Sarah was crying again, but softly now. She was wiser than both of us. She was, Michael agreed. Tell me another one. So he did. And then she told him one. And they sat there as the day faded into evening, sharing stories, sharing memories, sharing the weight of their grief, because it was too heavy to carry alone. Winter came hard that year. The garden disappeared under snow. The stakes stood like sentinels, marking what had been, what had grown, what had been lost. Sarah and Michael learned to talk again, though some days the words came easier than others. Some days they could laugh, remembering Mia's jokes, her funny faces, the way she'd narrate her entire life, like she was the star of her own adventure story. Other days they could barely function, the grief so overwhelming it pinned them in place, made breathing feel like an impossible task. But they learned to do it together. To sit in the silence when words failed. To hold each other when the pain was too much. To say, I'm not okay today, and have the other person understand that being not okay was part of this, would always be part of this. Michael stopped having dreams where he saved her. Instead, he dreamed of the garden, of plants growing in impossible patterns, and Mia walking between them, touching each leaf like a blessing. Sarah stopped driving past the accident site. She drove past the park instead, where Mia used to play, and though it hurt, it was a different kind of hurt. A hurt that held love inside it. They went to therapy. Together and separately. They learned words for what they were feeling, complicated grief, survivor's guilt, anticipatory anxiety. The labels didn't make it easier, but they made it nameable, something they could point to and say, this is what's happening to me. On what would have been Mia's 8th birthday, they went to the cemetery. They brought her favorite things, sunflowers, because she loved how they followed the sun, a little toy bee, because she'd been fascinated by pollinators, a drawing they'd made together of the 3 of them in the garden. Happy birthday, baby, Sarah whispered, her hand on the small headstone. We miss you so much. We're trying to be okay, Michael added. It's hard without you. But we're trying. They stayed until the sun set, talking to their daughter, telling her about their lives, about the grief support group they'd joined, about the scholarship they were setting up in her name at her school for kids who loved gardening. We're going to plant the garden again, Sarah said. In the spring. We'll plant it for you. Winter eventually loosened its grip. Snow melted. The ground thawed. And one morning in early March, Sarah woke Michael before dawn. Come on, she said. It's time. They went to the garden together, armed with gloves and tools and seeds. The stakes were still there, weathered now, some of the notes barely legible after months of snow and ice. Should we take them down? Michael asked. Sarah shook her head. Leave them. They're part of it now. Part of her garden. So they left the stakes standing, monuments to their grief, to their survival, to the words they'd learned to speak again. And around them, between them, they began to plant. Tomatoes, because Mia had loved them. Sunflowers, because she'd planted them taller than herself. Morning glories, blue and pink, because she'd seen her parents in their petals. Peppers and lettuce and cucumbers and strawberries. They worked side by side, their hands in the dirt, just as they'd done with Mia. And though she wasn't there, would never be there again, would be forever 7, forever in the ground instead of growing toward the sky, they felt her in the work. In the planting. In the hope that maybe, this time, something would grow. Do you think she'd like this? Sarah asked, sitting back on her heels, dirt smudged across her cheek. Michael looked at the freshly planted rows, at the stakes standing sentinel over new seeds, at his wife, his partner, his fellow survivor, his fellow griever, and nodded. I think she'd love it. They planted until the sun was high, until their backs ached, until every seed was in the ground. When they finished, they stood at the edge of the garden, arms around each other, looking at what they'd created. Now we wait, Sarah said. Now we wait, Michael agreed. Weeks passed. April rain fell soft and steady. And then, one morning, Sarah ran into the house, her voice bright with wonder, with something that sounded almost like joy. Michael, come look. He rushed outside, heart pounding, and found her kneeling by the tomato plants, her hands trembling. There, pushing through the earth, was the first green shoot. A tiny thing, fragile and new, reaching toward the sun. "It's growing," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Look, it's growing." Michael knelt beside her, and together they stared at the small miracle of new life emerging from the ground where they'd planted their grief, their words, their slowly healing hearts. "It's magic," he said softly, echoing their daughter's words. Sarah took his hand. "She was the magic," she said. "But maybe we can grow something beautiful anyway. Even without her. Even though it hurts. Maybe we can grow something." Over the following weeks, more shoots appeared. Tomatoes and peppers. Sunflowers and morning glories. The garden came alive in ways that felt both painful and beautiful, a reminder of what they'd lost and what they still had. They tended it together, every evening after work. They talked as they watered and weeded, about Mia, about themselves, about the future that stretched ahead of them, uncertain and frightening and somehow still possible. One evening, as they worked side by side, Sarah said, "I'll never stop missing her." "Neither will I," Michael said. "And I'll never stop being angry that she's gone." "Me either." "But I'm glad you're here," Sarah said, meeting his eyes. "I'm glad we're doing this together." "Me too," Michael said, and meant it with everything he had. The garden grew. Tomatoes ripened on the vine. Sunflowers reached toward the sky, not quite as tall as Mia had grown them, but tall enough. Morning glories climbed the fence, blue and pink, reaching, always reaching. And among them, the stakes stood. Dozens of them, bearing witness to the winter they'd survived, to the words they'd written when speaking felt impossible, to the grief they'd planted in the earth. Michael and Sarah didn't take them down. Instead, they left them as a reminder that love and loss could coexist, that broken people could heal without becoming unbroken, that sometimes the only way forward was through the garden that grew silence, to the other side where words came easier and hope could take root again. On what would have been Mia's 9th birthday, they stood in the garden at sunset, surrounded by growing things, and spoke to their daughter. "Look what grew," Sarah said softly. "Look what we grew for you." The evening breeze moved through the plants' rustling leaves, turning flowers toward the fading light. And for just a moment, just one brief, perfect moment, they could almost hear it, their daughter's voice, bright as birdsong, full of wonder. "It's magic, Mama." "Papa. It's magic." And maybe it was. The magic of survival. The magic of love that endures past death. The magic of two broken people learning to grow something beautiful in the ruins of their broken hearts. The garden grew. Winter would come again, as it always did. Plants would die and be replanted. Seasons would turn. But Sarah and Michael knew now that they could survive it. Together, they could survive anything. In the place where silence had grown, they had planted words. In the place where death had taken root, they had planted life. And in the place where their daughter had once ruled over her kingdom of flowers and growing things, they had planted hope. It was enough. It had to be enough. And so, together, they kept tending their garden, kept growing what they could, kept loving each other through the grief that would never fully leave them, but no longer stood between them like an impassable wall. They survived. They grew. They loved. And somewhere, in the places beyond words, their daughter smiled.